right, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take a seat, please. We're running a little late. Interview. It was brought to my attention that at an environmental seminar we're using paper cups. I wrote my name on mine and stuck it in here so that I could reuse it. You might consider doing that. The juice that we were served, that was brought to my attention, are not environmentally friendly containers since they are lined with aluminum. It was suggested that we boycott them, we don't buy them, we don't use them. We bring our own containers for juice from home if necessary. Flying here, the plastic garbage that is created in every one of those airplanes when they serve you lunch, everything is plastic. With the exception of Wardair, they have real China. Whenever we fly, we can impress upon them that we do not approve of their unrecyclable way of distributing lunches and dinners and drinks. Styrofoam cups. Back over here at an environment booth, we should boycott styrofoam cups. Everybody has so many ideas. The garbage bags. Just noticed the other day, before we left to come down here, Sandra pointed out to me that the co-op in Calgary is bringing out, because of consumer requests and pressure, recyclable garbage bags, soaps and cleaners, environmentally friendly products. The only problem with this, of course, is in the way we treat our garbage in landfill sites. To be biodegradable, as you know, it has to be subject to sunlight, and of course we bury a lot of our garbage. So we might bring pressure to bear on our municipal waste disposal and sanitation units. You can write the Environment Minister, Bouchard, postage free, and demand that he enact legislation to stop dumping raw sewage into Canadian waterways and coastal areas. Another suggestion was stop mergers and takeovers, create more competition, preserve jobs in the workplace. The thinking being that the competition would force companies to pay attention to consumers' demands. Boycotts do have an impact. Canada pollutes 25% of the Earth's pollution. We have the highest per capita pollution in the world, which of course is contributing to the greenhouse effect, which in turn is affecting the ozone layer, which in turn brings me to Cynthia Pollock-Shea, who is going to address you this afternoon. She is a senior researcher with the Worldwatch Institute, which is an international research organization based in Washington, D.C. She has written extensively on waste management and recycling, the very subjects we've just been talking about. as well as strategies to mend the ozone layer and on energy policies and technologies. Her expertise has been sought by policymakers worldwide, including those with World Bank, the U.S. Congress and the Environmental Protection Agency, the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, and the Department of the Environment in the United Kingdom. Mrs. Pollock-Shea is the author of 4 Worldwatch papers, the co-author of 5 annual editions of State of the World, and the author of dozens of magazine and newspaper articles. She is also the wife of Michael Shea, who is here with their newest product. Stand up, Mike, please. Isn't she beautiful?
And recyclable.
And recyclable, Mike said. It is due to Mike's good office that I am here, because he is the director of radio at CBC Calgary. And he allowed me to come with his blessings, because he considers this one of the most important, if not the most important, issues in the world today. And so it is, and to prove it, here is his wife, Cynthia Pollock-Shea.
Thank you, Norris. Don't tip over my cup. It's also up here. As you said, I'm based with the Worldwatch Institute, which is in Washington, D.C., but I live in Calgary now and have for the last year. Since some of you might not be familiar with Worldwatch Institute, though, I brought along a couple sample copies of our publications, Worldwatch Papers, State of the World, and now a bi-monthly magazine which we publish. In fact, for classroom purposes, the bi-monthly may be of most interest at the elementary and high school level. The Worldwatch Papers and State of the World, while they are used by about 700 college campuses in North America, might be a bit much for high school. I don't know, you'd have to assess it. But on to talk this afternoon. Really pleased to be here in Nelson, and really quite surprised and impressed by the number of people who have attended the Get High on Nature conference. I think that really speaks well as to the concern that people have about environmental issues. We've been hearing a lot lately about the deteriorating state of the environment, about sustainable economic development, about the lack of safe and economical sites to dispose of our discards, and about recycling. I'd like to talk about how all of these various factors interrelate, and about what we can do as teachers, school board members, students, and members of the community to put us on a more environmentally sound path. At first glance, the environment, can all of you hear me okay? I feel like this mic's going out, okay. At first glance, the environment, sustainable development, and recycling may have appeared to have little to do with one another, but in fact, they are very closely related. Processing the hundreds of millions of tons of goods that are used by Canadians and throughout the world each year consumes enormous amounts of energy. And if that energy comes from fossil fuels, that results in the emission of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas that is warming the Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is the #1 greenhouse gas and contributes to 50% of the potential global warming. As sustainable development starts to move from the rhetoric phase into the action phase, something Monty was addressing earlier this morning, how politicians are now using the catchphrases like sustainable development, but in fact not developing the policies to implement those sorts of strategies. As we see sustainable development actually moving to actionable steps, we'll see a lot of attention paid to the concepts of waste reduction, reuse, and recycling. In fact, I think that it will result in the emergence of a new definition of waste, and many of the things that today we call garbage will in fact be looked at as valuable resources that we need to use over and over again, because we certainly haven't used them up in terms of what they can offer us, but we no longer use them, we'll no longer use them just once. In fact, the problems that we're having today with so much garbage is symptomatic of our excessive use of natural resources. If we didn't consume as much, we wouldn't have nearly so much garbage to get rid of in the first place. Also, I'm sure that as residents of British Columbia, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the water pollution that results when paper is made. Water pollution also results from the processing of aluminum, glass, etc., as does air pollution. So when you're talking about energy, air pollution, water pollution, there are a lot of environmental factors that are related to our use of materials, our generation of waste, and recycling. Every year, each one of us discards several times our weight in garbage. For the most part, that consists of products and packaging that are very highly refined and that have frequently been transported for long distances. This one-night stand approach to products is denuding our forests, depleting our oil reserves, causing air and water pollution, and effectively burying us in our own waste. Because of the growing concern about the environment and the rising cost of traditional waste disposal options, people are discovering that there is no real way for our throwaways, and recycling programs are starting to proliferate. These new programs are no longer add-ons. They're not just paper drives by the Girl Guides or bottle drives by the local hockey team. Not that there's anything wrong with these, but they are, as adjuncts and add-ons, they divert a very small percentage of the waste stream and are really fundraisers for these groups as opposed to really dealing with the waste stream. When we're talking about recycling programs today, we're talking about programs that are an integrated component of municipal waste management systems. When people talk about 25% recycling, they're talking frequently about devoting 25% of the municipal waste budget to recycling programs. They're getting very serious about it. It's not just something at the end, it's something that we think about from the very beginning. And in fact, I think the time is coming when neighborhood welcoming committees will tell new residents where the schools are, where the community center is, and that recyclables get picked up on Tuesday. But what are we talking about when we talk about recycling? It's not just picking up separated materials at curbside or taking them to a central drop-off facility. It's also processing those materials and turning them into products that have economic value. Unfortunately, that full circle approach is too often overlooked, and a number of cities that are starting up recycling programs, curbside and drop-off facilities, are ignoring the markets side of recycling. They're not developing the markets to take the materials that are collected. They're doing so at their own peril, and they're reducing the economic viability of the recycling programs that they're advocating. Recycling is, while new to North America, not a new concept. In Japan and Europe, recycling is much more widely practiced, partly because they are not blessed with as many natural resources as we in North America are, and partly because of the very densely populated areas in Europe and Japan. They don't have the luxury of open spaces where they can dispose of their waste. They've run into that space crunch. They ran into it a long time ago They've started a number of recycling programs. In Japan, people separate their garbage into about 10 different waste streams, and over 50% of the waste in Japan is now recycled. People separate paper, glass, metals, batteries. There's even some types of paper people separate, and someone comes to the door and you hand them your waste paper, they hand you a roll or two of toilet paper. You're actually seeing the end product that can be made from what your contribution to the waste stream is. This also means that it's a very complicated collection system in Japan. I'm not sure that it's something that would be replicable in North America, but certainly many of the ideas and components of the system would be. Recycling programs are also spreading in Europe. I've traveled quite a bit to Europe in recent years, both for work and for vacations, and been quite surprised at the prevalence of recycling. I don't know if any of you have been there and seen them, but you frequently come across igloos, they're called. They're usually green, they're about this high, shaped like an igloo, and they have holes in the top, and you deposit your aluminum cans in one, your white glass in another, green glass in another, brown glass in another. There are bins for old paper. Some places there are bins for batteries, old medicines. Depends where you are, but quite a few materials are accepted. These are widely used in Germany, Italy, Austria, Switzerland, and in the Scandinavian countries, recycling is also quite widely practiced. There are also curbside programs, and you see garbage trucks driving around, or trucks that look like traditional garbage trucks, but in fact, they're just designated to pick up one material. We've seen trucks that pick up paper only and take it on to facilities for processing and making new paper products. The igloos that I was talking about are very widespread. In fact, even in the Black Forest, which is not a very populated area of the country, we saw igloos there next to the hiking trails, so people could deposit their materials there for recycling. In North American cities, recycling programs are quite a bit newer. The east and west coasts of the United States and in the upper Midwest, affordable, safe landfill sites are running out. And in some areas, the cost of disposing of a ton of garbage is now over $100. If you look at your local rates, you're probably not going to find them over 20. So that's a considerable cost, and one that has risen dramatically in recent years. In the cities of Toronto and Edmonton, space is also rapidly running out for disposing of garbage. The answer to this, the first answer that people thought up, was building more landfills. Well, the regulations have changed. You need to put a liner in so that pollutants don't get leached out into the groundwater. You need to put methane collection facilities so that the methane gas doesn't escape and start fires or explosions. So it's much more expensive to start a new landfill. Also, there's a lot of political opposition. Everybody wants their waste picked up, but nobody wants it put down, at least not near them. Same thing with waste-to-energy plants. These are facilities in which garbage is burned to make electricity. Sounds good, the waste is used to make a valuable product, but in fact there are a number of problems with these facilities as well. They're very expensive to build. They result in air pollution, including gases that result in acid rain. And outside of the air pollution, they result in large quantities of ash being generated. 10 to 30% of the incoming garbage ends up as ash, which has a very high concentration of heavy metals and is increasingly being viewed as toxic waste. So there are also a lot of problems with waste-to-energy plants. With the difficulty of siting both landfills and waste-to-energy facilities and the high cost of traditional waste disposal, recycling programs are getting a lot of attention. By 1990, it's estimated that 50 million North Americans will be served by curbside recycling programs. In fact, in the United States, there is now a national goal for 25% recycling nationwide by 1992. Right across the border in Washington State, the goal is 50% recycling by 1995. In Canada, there are no similar goals at the national or provincial level as of yet, although I shouldn't say that categorically. In Ontario, the government has claimed that it will divert 50% of the waste from landfills by the year 2000. But these large recycling rates that people are starting to advocate and that are technically achievable will not be accomplished simply by things like blue box programs used in residential areas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with them. It's a large blue box into which you put your metals and your glass and your paper, and you take it out to curbside, and it's collected for recycling. Well, in order to divert a large share of the waste stream, you also need to focus on the industrial sector and the commercial sector, and you need to collect more materials from the residential sector. Just collecting newspapers, for example, is not enough of the paper stream. You've got to be collecting more. I mentioned paper. When you look at what the waste stream is made up of, 40% of it is paper. So that's the number one component to look at in terms of recycling. Number two is kitchen and yard waste, which make up 30% of the waste stream. After that come glass and metals, each at about 9%, and then plastics at 8%. The rest is a wide variety of miscellaneous materials, textiles, wood, tires, etc. But newspapers are the largest, paper is the largest category, newspapers the largest single item in the waste stream. And disposable diapers are also growing as a single source. In fact, worldwide, diaper manufacturing currently consumes 1 billion trees every year. When you're looking at newspaper and trying to get a sense of how many trees are devoted to making newspapers, one Sunday edition of the New York Times, which is a quite thick paper, if you were to recycle it instead of make it from virgin paper, that would leave 75,000 trees standing. So the impact can be quite great. In fact, the trash disposed of by this country's cities is a motherlode of highly processed materials. A city the size of Vancouver disposes of more steel than is produced by a small iron mine, more copper than a medium-sized copper mine, and more paper than a good-sized timber stand. Vancouver is a mine. The question is how to mine it most effectively and how to get the maximum value from the materials that are collected. Recycling is not a garbage to gold proposition, as many people in the 1970s thought. They hoped that they would collect waste, sell it, make a lot of money, the environment would be better off, everything would be great. In fact, recycling is pretty expensive, but in many areas it's now cheaper to collect materials for recycling and then sell them for processing to make new products, or when markets are bad, even give them away, than it is to pay for collection and to dispose of those materials. So even if it's not a money maker, if it saves cities money, it reduces the outlay for waste. The key, however, one other thing I should mention at this point. When looking at costs, it's not just comparing the straightforward cost of recycling, though, to the cost of waste disposal. What's eliminated from that calculation is the current costs of waste disposal, like air pollution, water pollution, and the health effects that result from that. So we also need to take fuller cost accounting of what the costs are of current approaches. But to ensure that recycling programs are economically viable, we need to develop markets for the products made from the recycled materials. The most important area to look at in terms of waste volumes is paper. High grades, like computer and ledger paper, have good markets now, but collection programs are not very advanced. Office buildings, schools, hospitals, etc. generate large amounts of high-grade paper, but they often don't have access to collection programs. So it's not just their fault that the recycling's not done. You have to have both the generators of the waste and people to come around to collect the materials. Some companies, however, are starting to participate in recycling programs, and AT&T is one of them. Through an internal paper recycling program, the company saved $1 million last year in disposal costs and made a $365,000 profit. That's just one company. And it may be a project that at your schools you could think about adopting, trying to find out who the takers are of the high-grade paper in the community and setting up bins in the school to collect the paper and recycle it. The waste disposal costs for the school would be lessened, and depending on the markets, you may even make money through the activity. As more and more cities pick up newspaper for recycling, the markets are getting glutted. Some programs have been discontinued, others are paying for their paper to be taken away, and in Ontario, $300,000 a month are now being spent to warehouse the newspaper that's been collected, but that does not yet have a market. The problem is that in all of Canada, there is only one de-inking facility to take the ink out of newsprint and to make it into new newsprint. That plant is in Thorold, Ontario, and it's owned by the Quebec and Ontario Paper Company, as well as the Chicago Tribune. About 90% of the output goes to the Chicago Tribune. The Toronto Sun and a few papers in St. Catharines get the remainder. As far as getting rid of the glut in the Ontario market, there is a new de-inking facility being built in Woodby, Ontario, by the Atlantic Packaging Company. It's not going to be open until 1990, and it won't be running at full capacity until 1993. That'll help communities in Ontario, but it's not going to do anything for newspaper recycling programs in Western Canada. Neither British Columbia, with its large pulp and paper industry, nor Alberta, which is building 8 large new mills, have a de-inking facility. All of the newspaper that's currently collected in these two provinces is either exported to Asia, primarily to Korea, or used in construction materials, such as insulation and roofing shingles. With all of the government funding that is going to polluting virgin mills, it's time to provide some financial assistance to the recycling industry. Alberta Environment is now examining the possibility, and I suspect that sometime within the next year an announcement will be made endorsing and making money available for a de-inking facility in the province. It's really sort of strange that something that we consider not to have any value is in great demand in international trade, and countries like Korea and Japan, which are doing quite well economically, are taking our old paper, making it into things like boxes in which they sell as VCRs. Something screwed up there. When it comes to newsprint specifically, it is possible to make newsprint from 100% recycled fiber. In fact, there are 2 companies in the United States that are already doing that, FSC Paper outside of Chicago and Garden State Paper. There are some concerns amongst newspaper publishers that the paper cannot be used on high-speed presses and to take color photos, that it must be used on things like classified ads and weekend supplements. Well, even that's a great place to start, and a large volume of the paper used to print newspapers. And certainly There are other newspaper publishers who found that they can use quite a bit more. The Los Angeles Times, for instance, I think now uses about 80% recycled fiber in its newsprint. So it's possible to print papers using mainly recycled fiber. Also, the technologies for using newsprint made from recycled fiber are evolving quite quickly. In fact, in Alberta, where the new pulp and paper mills are coming online over the next couple years, they've been looking at the sorts of printing technologies used by different companies and finding that they're changing rapidly, almost monthly. And those changes are coming primarily out of places like Sweden and Japan and other countries in Asia, which are using large volumes of paper from the United States and Canada. So the technologies are there. It's just a matter of keeping tabs on the recent developments and implementing them, building facilities to use them. In the United States, federal legislation to promote newspaper recycling is currently being considered. Only one state has a law in place today, and that is Connecticut. It requires newspaper publishers in the state, as well as distributors of newspapers that have large circulations in Connecticut, to use newsprint made from secondary fiber. Within 2 years, old newspapers are supposed to make up at least 40% of newsprint content, and that minimum percentage would increase over the years. Wisconsin and California are considering adopting similar laws, and as I mentioned, federal legislation may also be introduced. If it is, and if it's passed, it's going to have a profound effect on Canada. 80% of the newsprint made in this country is exported to the United States. So requiring minimum recycling content would mean that de-inking facilities would have to be built throughout Canada. And that's an expensive proposition. When you're talking about adding a de-inking facility to an existing pulp and paper mill, it's a cost of $50 to $80 million. When you're talking about building a new facility from scratch, you're talking about investing $200 to $300 million. So what sort of assurances does the paper industry require to invest in these facilities? It needs to have guaranteed supplies of old newspapers so that they won't have to worry about whether or not they're going to have enough to run the facility. And it also means that there must be markets for the recycled newsprint, that newspaper publishers must be willing to buy it and use it, or forced into doing so through legislation. Greater recycling of newsprint would have a tremendous impact, both on the waste stream and on the environment. If just half of the newsprint consumed in the United States each year were recycled, it would divert 6 million tons of material from landfills, or enough to fill up 3,200 garbage trucks every single day. By using recycled paper instead of virgin fiber to make new paper products, energy use would be reduced substantially. In fact, depending on the process, it would be reduced by from 23 to 74%. Air pollution would be reduced by 3/4, water pollution by 1/3, and water use by more than half. When it comes to other grades of paper, like mixed supplies that include your junk mail and colored paper, envelopes, magazines, the markets are even weaker. To strengthen them will require commitments by governments and other large institutions to buy recycled paper. It will also require consumer acceptance of paper products that aren't sparkling white. And it will also require more initiatives like that of Loblaws superstores to sell toilet paper made from 100% recycled paper. Every year, Canada destroys a forest the size of Prince Edward Island to produce pulp and paper products. And only by reducing the amount of paper used in packaging, by each of us producing less waste, and by recycling, can we start to lower that figure. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into nearly this degree of detail when talking about all of the different materials in the waste stream. It would take forever. But I especially wanted to address paper because it is so important. We discard more of it than any other material, and it's also a mainstay to the economy in British Columbia and in fact throughout Canada. The forest products industry accounts for about 10% of this country's GNP. So what we do as far as managing our forests, new pulp and paper developments, de-inking facilities, and paper recycling will have a profound effect on the economy and on the environment. Okay, let's get to the second category, food and yard waste. That accounts for about 30% of the waste stream. And if we want to keep that out of landfills, the way to do it is to compost. There are probably some of you here who have compost piles in your backyard that you use to enrich your gardens. Well, municipalities can do the same thing and are starting to do so. The compost can be used for landscaping, on highway right-of-ways, in parks, and on public golf courses. In fact, this is even more important in developing countries where about 80% of the waste is organic materials that can be composted and where they're trying to boost agricultural production. Compost used on agricultural fields provides many benefits, including enhancing the water retention capacity of the soil and enriching the soil. It's been used for a number of years in Europe, and in fact, much of the French wine that you may drink is grown on vineyards where compost is used. That's right, not all of you can drink wine, some of you. Recycling programs for aluminum and glass beverage containers are already developed because of long-standing deposit programs. Aluminum will always be in high demand because it takes only 5% as much energy to make an aluminum can from scrap as it does to make it from bauxite. In fact, in terms of the energy savings, if you were to throw out an aluminum can, it's like throwing it out half full of gasoline. Also, air pollution is reduced considerably when aluminum is recycled instead of made from scratch. As far as glass goes, the greatest savings are associated with refillable containers that simply need to be washed out and reused. Non-refillable glass can also be crushed and melted into new glass bottles, and sometimes that's done, but frequently it's made into things like stucco, reflective road signs, and sometimes even used for asphalt in roads. Of course, unless you're served by a curbside recycling programs, things like aluminum pie plates and mayonnaise and applesauce jars cannot be recycled. And yet, there's no good reason why virtually all glass containers could not be made in a standardized, refillable design. In fact, that's in fact one of the lessons we may have to learn from centrally planned economies. Countries like East Germany currently do that because they don't have the resources to play with that we've traditionally felt that we do. And in fact, in the West, where advertisers, marketers, and packaging companies focus on product differentiation, everyone's trying to make their product look different. Different materials, different sizes, different shapes, when in fact all you really need is a different label to tell you what's inside the glass jar. Okay, that leaves us with plastics as the next large component in the waste stream. Plastics have been getting a lot of negative publicity lately, and in most cases, I think that's justified. Last year, just 1% of plastics were recycled. That's higher when it comes to things like plastic pop bottles. But even there, recycling rates don't get anywhere near something like 50%. In the United States last year it was 20% for plastic pop bottles. And yet, plastics are made from a non-renewable resource. They're made from petroleum. And because they take up so much volume, they're rapidly filling up landfill sites. The makers of plastic resins are starting to get the message and very slowly starting to do something about it. They're starting to see that unless they act quickly, they're going to be regulated off the market. The problem is that because plastics are so light and so bulky, they're very expensive to collect for recycling. And not many places are recycling plastics yet, even when they do collect other materials. Also, unless plastics are separated by resin type, which is a time-consuming and expensive process, they are difficult to recycle and make into high-value products. Mixed plastics can be made into things like plastic lumber that's used for fencing and pier supports, park benches, even things like flower pot containers. But there's only a limited market for these materials. Even plastic pop bottles are not made into new bottles because of the contamination threat. They are shredded, they're pelletized, and they're used to make fiberfill insulation for things like ski jackets, sleeping bags, and pillows. They're also used to make things like toaster handles and paintbrush bristles. Some manufacturers, though, are starting to use recycled plastics in their packaging. Procter & Gamble is one of those companies. In its spick and span containers and in its Tide detergent containers, it's starting to use recycled plastics. The company is also starting to look at reducing the amount of waste its products generate by selling refillable bottles for things like laundry detergent and fabric softeners. What you do is buy the big bottle once, and then the next time you go to the store, you buy a little packet of concentrate, take that home, put it in the big bottle, mix it with water. Still be making waste, not as much as you did before, according to the theory. Whether or not consumers are receptive to that yet or not is another question. As a new parent, one of the markets that I think that also exists that hasn't been tapped is to use things like old shampoo bottles to make kids' toys and high chairs. So many of the things that kids use are made from plastics, and yet I suspect less than 5% of it at this point is made from recycled plastics, and there's no reason that it couldn't be. There are some pilot projects that are starting up now to recycle plastic foams. The foams used in school cafeterias and in fast food restaurants. But even those, which are just starting, don't get at the root of the problem. If we're really serious about reducing the waste stream, then school cafeterias and restaurants would serve their items on dishes with cutlery that could be washed and reused. Barring that, they could at least use paper wrappings that could be thrown onto the compost heap. There are a number of other items that we could go on to discuss. I've addressed mainly the household waste stream, but there are things like automobile tires. The rule of thumb is that there's one tire produced per person per year across the country. They float to the top of landfills. They're a fire hazard. They're a problem. In some places, they're starting to put deposits on tires so that the cost of disposing of them are collected early on, excuse me, and so that consumers bring their tires back. That also means you need recycling programs. Some of the recycling programs that work make things like grocery cart wheels, mats for flatbed trucks, industrial pallets, railroad crossings. There are things that can be made from tires, but there are very few facilities out there working now that do that. In fact, what's commonly done, most commonly done is put in landfills. Next commonly done is they're burned for the energy. But It's a very pollution-intensive process. They result in really nasty emissions unless you have really high-temperature incinerators. Something else that's been getting attention, car batteries. It's another thing that people are starting to talk about putting deposits on to make sure that people bring them back for recycling. That way you keep the heavy metals and the acids out of the landfills. Something which I haven't really addressed, and I won't spend a lot of time on, but I think it's important for you to think about when you're thinking about waste reduction, reuse, recycling issues, is not just volume reduction of waste, but also toxicity reduction in the waste stream. Things like batteries, paints, dyes, pesticides, inks, all have heavy metals in them. And those heavy metals, when they are released into the air or into the water supplies, cause health problems. In some areas, you don't even realize that heavy metals are used in, like inks, for example. I don't know how many of you were aware that they're used in making inks in plastics as a stabilizer. Cadmium is used, and in fact that's one of the greatest sources of cadmium in the waste stream, and yet it's something that's not immediately obvious. To deal with these toxic items in the waste stream, need to develop programs, things like returning them to the place where you bought them, making the sellers and suppliers responsible for safely disposing of them. Also, collection days. A number of communities are starting these up on a quarterly or annual basis to try and keep these toxic components out of the waste stream because of the threats they pose to groundwater, to waste handlers, and to air quality when they're burned in incinerators. The most important thing to look at, I think, is new product formulations. When it comes to inks for newspapers, for example, some publishers are now using inks made from soybeans or from canola oil. So you don't have to use heavy metals. In Japan, they're working on making batteries that don't use heavy metals. In West Germany, there's an Oro line of products being marketed that's all natural paints, cleansers, and adhesives. So you don't have to worry about introducing those toxic chemicals into your house or disposing of the products once you've used them. If we're really going to get to the root of the waste problem, it's going to require serious rethinking by all members of society. Governments need to examine the subsidies that they give to virgin resources and the penalties that they impose on secondary materials. Ideally, they'd remove subsidies and things like the oil depletion allowance or preferential transportation rates and tax rates to companies using virgin resources. But if they're not brave enough to do that, the least they could do would be to offer the same incentives to recyclers, at least put them on equal footing when it comes to access to government largesse. You also, in private industry, companies need to incorporate environmental concerns into product development, into packaging decisions, and into manufacturing processes. And consumers have to make it known that they don't want overpackaged, throwaway products. We also have to follow through by making intelligent purchasing decisions at the grocery store and by buying products and packaging made from recycled materials. How many of you know, for instance, that if you look at the inside of your cereal box or your cracker box and it's gray, that it's made from recycled paper? If it's white, it's not. In the school system, we need to build in an awareness to how the ecosystem works and how our activities alter its functioning at the earliest possible levels. Japan already does this. They start environmental education at a very young age. They take kids on field trips to electric generating facilities, to the local recycling plants. They teach them about the fact that Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources, that they need to be conserved and used widely. but that's not something that's traditionally done in Western countries. Also, I think that the approach to environmental studies in the schools have to change somewhat. Granted, a lot of schools don't even have environmental studies courses yet, but environmental studies courses don't have to be taught separately. They're not a separate area of instruction, but in fact they can be incorporated into discussions about science, energy, transportation, geography, home economics. Virtually everything we do has an effect on the environment. And to bring up some of those interrelationships so that students are more aware of them, I think is extremely helpful. Because only when students start to value the healthy functioning of the planet will they question how our activities impair that healthy functioning. Finally, as concerned citizens, people have to put pressure on their elected officials to clamp down on polluters, to revise outdated economic policies, to offer recycling programs, and to encourage the development of markets for recycled materials. In the beginning, there have to be things like government-sponsored procurement programs, purchasing agents who are required to buy products made from recycled materials if they're available at a competitive price. Sometimes price preferences are even offered. This is something that's not going to have to continue forever, but initially these products tend to be considered specialty items and are sometimes more expensive and harder to get. As the demand for them picks up, the lower costs of making them will be reflected in the price tag, and as they become standard off-the-shelf items, you won't have to have these incentives in place anymore. In Europe, a record number of Green Party candidates were recently elected to the European Parliament. Monty was talking about Green parties in Canada this morning, or had a question about it. I share the belief that I don't think a new party is really the answer. It takes too long a time to be incorporated into the political mainstream and to really have a voice. And yet, while the emergence of a strong Green Party is unlikely, I think that existing political parties can be made much more responsive to environmental issues. But one of the most important way of achieving that change in awareness and concern is by voters making their concerns known to the politicians. Well, I should probably stop now so that we can get on to the afternoon workshops, but I'll take questions first. I just want to say something that, I don't know if it's helpful, but for the students here, I think sometimes you wonder when you're in high school or you're at university how you can put your concerns into action, whether or not anyone's ever really going to hire you because you're concerned about the environment and you want to do something for it. And you can. When I was in university, I studied economics, environmental studies, and international relations. My advisors thought I was nuts. They had no idea how those things went together or how I'd get a job, because it's not something that you see want ads for in the newspaper. And yet I knew that that's what I wanted to put together, that I wanted to work on energy, environment, and development issues. And I moved to Washington because I thought that was the most likely place to find a job in that sector. There's certainly other areas now where one can do that, but then that was probably the best place to be. And I did, and there is a demand out there for generalists who can work on a lot of different issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. If you have a background in a lot of different subject areas, you can bring much greater light on subjects sometimes than those who have a very specialized background. If you're aware of how certain action will affect economics, will affect politics, will affect the environment, will affect international trade, that's a very valuable skill. And so you can find employment at the same time pursuing your concerns to improve the environment.
We're going to open it up for questions now. We have the wireless mic right there. For those in the front row, I'll be down here.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think very well the same. But one question remains that I would like to hear, or maybe you can answer, is how can we approach the government? Like, I have a whole box of batteries from clients that bring their cameras back with mercury batteries and lithium and what have you. They're nicely, they're nice batteries, but they don't help me, and they go into the dump and they destroy our groundwater. And there is a whole box of aluminum foils, like you mentioned, and which is totally correct. They can't be recycled as of now. So how can we approach the officials or whoever to get this flowing, this material? Like, I come from a country where these values we have these values for things, not to throw them away. And that's exactly what I did, and I felt that I should have the possibility to get it back into the mainstream.
I think you're right. You should have that opportunity available to you. You're not going to be able to change things overnight as far as government saying, oh, yeah, we were wrong, come bring us your batteries. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that fast. But if you contact local politicians, say, I've got these batteries. I know that if I put them into my garbage, that they're going to get into the landfill, they're going to pollute the groundwater, people are going to drink it, they're going to get sick. I don't know if you contacted politicians yet or not, but put pressure on them. Put pressure on the industries that sell the batteries. Contact them, ask them if they have any research underway to develop batteries that don't use heavy metals. When you are in stores that sell batteries, ask them what they're doing. Ask them if they'd be willing to take batteries, since they're part of the problem by selling them, whether or not they'd be willing to take them back, to dispose of them responsibly. And those are all individual actions that if enough people take, industry and governments will start to feel the heat and say, yeah, there really is a problem here. This is something that we have to deal with. And it's not quick, unfortunately. It doesn't happen rapidly enough. But unless you ask those questions and other people ask those questions, they're not even going to be aware that there's a concern. And they may not really know that much that it's a problem. But as you make your concerns known, and as more people make their concerns known, they realize that not only is there a problem, but people want it to be remedied. And then hopefully we'll work together with you to do that.
This is more a piece of information. Just a month ago, the BC Minister of the Environment, I'm here.
Sorry.
Announced to a convention of BC municipal politicians that negotiations are underway for a de-inking plant in BC, right. And which is really good news, because you're right, it's so important. So I think it's important the people here know that, so we can track those negotiations and make sure that it happens very soon. Do
you know where in BC that would be, and whether or not the government's putting up funds for it?
I believe my understanding was they were negotiating with an existing pulp and paper company for, certain concessions, incentives and whatnot, and that it would be in if not at the coast, the lower mainland area of Vancouver Island, not in the interior, unfortunately.
Well, I know that the pulp and paper companies have spoken with municipalities before and said, if we start up a de-inking facility, do you promise to give us your paper? So they have locked up the market. They have been thinking about it for a while, but I hadn't known that they'd actually made plans to go ahead, and I think that's great. As I said before, I think that you should get rid of all the subsidies for the virgin materials, but if you're not going to do that, I think government should assist in developing the de-inking facilities. People think about the job loss, from forestry or something if we're using more recycled paper, but in fact, it's usually a net gain in employment when we go for things like de-inking facilities through the collection network, the processing, the making products with higher economic value, distributing them. You're generating a lot of local employment opportunities, and so it's an economic development option that governments by nature should be interested in getting involved in.
Over here next, please.
Yeah. As one who hikes and bicycles in the countryside and is always picking up litter, bottles and cans, I don't understand why the government does not put a greater deposit on these articles so they won't be thrown away. You could put a deposit of 25 cents and maybe it'll be thrown away, but it'll be picked up and returned. But if you put a deposit of, say, $1 on a can or a bottle, the person will think twice before throwing it away. Why is there not a greater deposit put on these things when you first buy them?
Well, I'm sure that the main reason has been because the bottlers have opposed it, and they have a very strong political voice. They don't want the sales of their products to decrease. That was a big issue in Ontario when the recycling program started. The bottlers were threatened with higher deposits if they didn't achieve certain minimum recycling rates, and that was enough to get them to cooperate in developing strong recycling programs and starting the Blue Box program. Higher deposits might make sense. I'm sort of torn though on that, I have to be honest. In Canada, the use of deposit systems is quite widespread, and in the absence of other recycling programs, I think it's a great idea. In the United States, there are about 10 states with deposit programs. The rest don't have them. And when states are considering where to go from here, I advise them, don't adopt a deposit program, adopt a curbside recycling program, and the beverage containers are going to drive the economics of the program by bringing in the most revenues. So in a way, while Canada has done much better in terms of deposits, it's going to be somewhat at a disadvantage when curbside programs start up because the most valuable materials in the waste stream are the beverage containers. But in the absence of Blue Box programs, higher deposits may make sense. It's a difficult political battle, though.
Blue boxes don't do away with litter. That's what I'm saying. It's the litter that I'm talking about in the garden. Litter is not the blue box.
Well, that's true. I think that there's already quite a bit of public pressure and condemnation of litterers. There are heavy penalties that have been put into effect. You know, if you get caught littering on the highway, it's $500. You're not going to have people patrolling backwoods trails. No, I don't know how you get around that except to educate people as to the merits of recycling and the disadvantages of littering. One way to do it that some companies are advocating is using photodegradable plastics. When they're littered, they degrade. I personally don't like the idea much. It tends to make litterers feel better about what they do. It's in a landfill, you're not going to expose the material to sunlight, so it's not going to help it degrade at all. And what do you get when it degrades? It's usually not benign materials, just smaller pieces of what you started with.
We'd like to get a recycling program started at our school, but we're encountering a problem with transportation because we live in a community where we need 2 ferries to get there, and we don't have a recycling plant in our school or in our town. And we'd like to know if you have any ideas of where to get some funding to transport by truck or by any other means materials to Vancouver.
Well, certainly the further you are from the markets, the more of a problem it's going to be. The higher the transportation costs are, the more difficult it is to implement the program and make it be economically viable. Where I would start, if I were you, is to find out what sort of materials are delivered to the community. Obviously, a lot of things are trucked in, you know, paper products, food products, construction materials, you name it. Find out whether or not those trucks and ferries go back full. Frequently, companies deliver products and they go back empty. It doesn't make sense. They waste a lot of energy doing it, but that happens a lot. And when people look at starting up recycling programs, especially when communities are far from traditional markets, it makes a lot of sense when you can add on through a backhaul system.
Safeway has started, they fill up their trucks and bring it back, but a woman in our community is trying to get Overweighty and Super Value and other larger grocery stores to start the same thing, but we're just having a problem with our own because they just crush up their boxes and stuff and bring them back, but that fills up their trucks and stuff.
Well, I think explore. I suspect that you're going to find some things that do go back empty, and depending on what you're offering them, it may be more valuable than what they're taking back to start with. Also, depending on how much processing the community does. If it's just a school, it may not make sense to invest in things like shredders and pelletizers for plastics or can crushers. But if you can get the whole community involved, it may make sense to invest in those things. And if you can decrease the volume by weight, it's going to be a more valuable cargo to haul, and there would be more interest in doing so.
Over here.
I can quite strongly relate to what you've been saying about recycling, because during the war, when I was a child in the UK, Britain had to recycle out of economic necessity all the products you've been talking about, and I believe quite firmly in it, and that it can be done here. On another matter, when I was listening to my car radio at lunchtime, some New Brunswick residents were strongly protesting government proposals to have a plant put in their area to deactivate PCBs. And we all know the charade about the PCBs from Quebec going to UK and back. We all know the problem has to be addressed and solved, not only of PCBs but other harmful chemicals and deactivating them. But nobody wants these plants in their backyards. What's the solution to this dilemma?
Well, first I'd just like to make a comment about World War II. Recycling was much more widespread in the United States, Canada, UK. People even saved things like old nylons and rope, hair, bones, you name it. There was a feeling that it was important to do that and beneficial for society. And while we don't want a war to bring about that same sort of thinking, that's the sort of thinking that it's going to take to really get serious about recycling. But even more important than recycling is reducing the amount of waste we produce in the first place, and that gets to your PCB and other toxics questions. A number of companies, fortunately, are finally starting to do this. Companies like 3M, they have a pollution prevention pays program that they started about 15 years ago. And they asked all employees at the facility to make suggestions as to how products could be reformulated, processes changed, what new pollution controls could be put into effect, etc., so that materials that were currently wasted would instead be used as resources to make new products. 3M has cut its waste in half and saved millions of dollars through that program. Other companies are starting to look at the same thing, but that's where the attention needs to be placed. Obviously we have to clean up what we've already dirtied. There's a lot of toxic waste dumps, and there are a lot of new technologies for dealing with them, from bacteria that eat them to glassifying them and making them inert, etc. Filters for cleaning up the water that passes through them. But that's just short term. Long term, what you want to be looking at is to keep these chemicals from being released in the first place, and that's where the priority should go, and is starting to.
I think that before we can look at other people and ask them to change the ways, I think we have to look at ourselves. And one thing I noticed was there were a lot of paper bags from lunches in the garbage bags. I think they can probably be used more than once, whereas now they're probably pretty slimy, and I doubt if many people want to use them again.
There were a lot of them left here, too. There were a lot of them left here, too, from this morning.
One other thing I have to suggest too, maybe not in terms of recycling, but if people, when they're walking around, would just pick up garbage around. I mean, to begin with, it would make it look cleaner. And if people are picking up garbage, they're not as inclined to throw it away. In terms of that, it'd make things.
You comment about paper bags. I think that it's indicative of so many different areas where we don't really think about the materials that we use and where there are alternatives available. As I mentioned earlier, I think it makes much more sense in places like cafeterias and fast food restaurants to use dishes and cutlery as opposed to the plastics and paper. If you are going to use the paper, certainly if you're going to bring your own lunch, you could take home the paper bag and use it again. Here, Whether or not people are going to go through the efforts to collect them and use them again is unlikely. Plus, people just have this, if they see a crumpled paper bag with the grease spot, people are sort of repelled by that. And maybe that sort of thinking has to change too. You know, it's not going to hurt what's inside of it. Is it really bad to get that? But in addition, paper used for food wrappings frequently will not be recycled. It's not real high value. It is contaminated. But what you can do is throw it on the compost heap and it'll degrade, and you can use that compost for landscaping, for gardens, etc. When it comes to picking up trash, I mean, sure, it's a good idea. I do it sometimes too, but I don't really think that that's the sort of system we want. What we want is for people not to be using so much in the way of products and packaging, and for them to be recycling what they do use if the opportunity is made available for them to recycle, which is a problem in a lot of areas, and to be responsible about discarding their own materials in the appropriate manner. While picking up is good, it's better to have people not drop it in the first place.
Over here.
Is there a standard population base or market size that's required for a community recycling program or blue box programs to operate with economic efficiency? Like, is there enough research on that to know you have to have a certain standard, a certain population base to do that?
It depends on the type of program, the type of materials, how far you are from markets. They're all very important factors. In some, I mean, certainly recycling programs have spread the most in highly populated areas along the East Coast, in Toronto, etc. You can justify the cost because there are markets nearby, and there are there's a large population base that will be the consumers of the products made from those materials. When it comes to different types of materials, things like aluminum, very lightweight, very high value, tremendous energy savings associated with it, makes a lot more sense to truck aluminum long distance than it does to truck glass or junk mail, which has lower value. But there are ways that smaller communities have effectively and economically adopted recycling programs. The state of New Hampshire, for example, is very rural and yet has very strong recycling programs. People don't even have curbside collection because it's not densely populated enough, but at the local dumps they have drop-off facilities for recyclables. You put your brown glass in one container, your green in another, your metals in another, your plastics in another. They even have bookshelves. You bring your old books. It's a library. It's really developed in sort of a community center too. But then all the towns pool their resources, and they've invested in paper balers, can crushers, plastic shredders, and pelletizers, so that they are processing their materials to make them even more valuable in the marketplace, to cover the longer transportation costs and to make up for the lower density of the population. So it depends where you are, but small communities can make recycling viable.
Where are we over here?
Our industrialized nation was sort of built on the entrepreneurial person who went out and had incentives to make money. And I wonder if that would work in this way, if the government, for instance, had a 10 or 20-year moratorium on any money made recycling material was, say, income tax free.
I don't think they'd be willing to go quite that far, but the idea is great, is being put into practice a lot of places, and is driving a lot of recycling. Sometimes it's a matter of just finding access to capital. There's a company called St. Jude Plastics. It's named after the patron saint of hopeless causes, in part because every time they went to look for money, everyone said, no, it'll never work. They did get low interest loans to build a facility to take in PET plastic, polyethylene terephthalate, kind used in pop bottles. They shred it. The market for the plastic is grown phenomenally. They're tripling their capacity and may expand very shortly again. that was just low interest loans being made available at the first step, access to capital. One of the things that seems to work as far as governments getting involved in assisting industry or entrepreneurs, in the state of Oregon, there are tax credits available to companies that engage in processes that either reduce pollution or reduce energy use. And money in terms of tax credits has been made available for capital investment in things like de-inking facilities. Now that's important. When you're talking about making funds available for something like a de-inking facility, assisting that, that's a facility that will be able to take waste paper for 20, 30 years. You're ensuring a market for a long period of time. It's got a high payback. What some places are talking about doing is consumption tax credits. The tonnage that you take in, you get a certain credit for. But that's much more short-term, much more influenced by the vagaries of government budgets, doesn't make for long-term markets for the materials. So there are a lot of things governments can do, and it makes most sense, I think, to look at for how long a period of time they're going to be in effect, and for how important it is to get that material out of the waste stream because of its high volumes, because of its value, or because of the environmental damage that it causes. But a lot of incentives, tax incentives, sometimes there are sales tax exemptions. Some states have them for buying equipment for recycling. Some areas are talking about things like packaging taxes. So if your packaging is made from virgin materials instead of recycled materials, the supplier of that package would be taxed. So in order to be and so he's going to pass it on to the consumer, but in order to be the lowest cost supplier of the packaging, you would use recycled materials. The funds are collected, they're used for environmental programs. I think that's another thing that I'll just briefly mention is that too often taxes are used to encourage or discourage certain environmental activities, and then the money is just thrown into general revenues and not used for environmental programs. I think that it should, if you're taxing something for an environmental purpose, the funds should be used for an environmental program.
One more over here.
Well, it's on. Okay. I'm involved in recycling in our rural area, and I'm really pleased to hear what you say. You make it sound possible for us. But what I've been doing in my life is educating myself towards recycling so that I'm actually recycling into the landfill. So that I separate everything into 10 different things, and then when it goes into the landfill, it's marked on it, and I feel somehow it relieves my conscience. And I suggest that people do that because I think at some point landfills will have to be recycled or capped.
I certainly applaud the gesture. I'm not sure about the efficacy of it right now, but I think that you're right. In the long term, places like landfills, waste-to-energy plants will probably be barred from taking materials that are recyclable, or possibly they would actually go back and mine landfills to find the recyclable materials. And if they are barred from taking recyclables, that often means that there's a curbside program set up, or else at the landfill or incinerator, the materials are separated because they've been collected separately or because they go through a mechanical processor at the landfill or incinerator, and then they're recycled instead of being buried or burned. And that's going to happen more and more.
Help me thank Cynthia Pollock-Shea. Now, we borrowed from your coffee break, so your sessions will start in 15 minutes at 2:45, your workshop sessions, and they can go on 15 minutes past the designated time. We've backed everything up 15 minutes to allow question and answer period.